A hardworking employee overlooked. A greedy manager exposed. What happens when the tables finally turn? Stay tuned for a shocking story of betrayal, justice, and a twist no one saw coming. The fluorescent lights in the sleek, open-concept office buzzed faintly, their hum swallowed by the low murmur of conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards. The team gathered in the glass-walled conference room, seated at a polished oak table that gleamed under the harsh lighting. Everyone except for Elijah Reed. Elijah stood by the coffee station, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but focused. His tailored suit, sharp and well-fitted, belied the frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. Across the room, the manager, Brian Carson, leaned back in his chair, exuding the smug confidence of a man who thought he owned the world, or at least this office. "Elijah," Brian called out, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you mind stepping in for a second? We need to wrap this up." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he stepped forward, his movements measured. His colleagues avoided his gaze, some pretending to sift through papers, others staring at their screens as if their lives depended on it. The tension was palpable. Brian gestured toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, furthest from his own. "Take a seat," he said with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. As Elijah sat down, Brian cleared his throat and scanned the room, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "As you all know," Brian began, his tone dripping with feigned camaraderie, "we've been reviewing candidates for the regional manager position. It's a big role, a lot of responsibility, and we need someone who truly represents the values of this company." Elijah's gaze didn't waver, but the flicker of a shadow crossed his face. He knew where this was going, had known for weeks, but the sting of anticipation still gnawed at him. Brian paused dramatically, savoring the moment. And after much deliberation, Brian continued, his grin widening, "We've decided to go with someone who's shown real initiative and leadership." His eyes darted briefly to Elijah, then away, as though the mere acknowledgement was too much. "Claire will be stepping into the role. Let's give her a round of applause." Polite clapping echoed through the room, hollow and obligatory. Claire, seated next to Brian, flushed with pride and glanced at Elijah, her expression a mix of triumph and awkwardness. Elijah nodded curtly, his face impassive, but his hands clenched beneath the table. "Congratulations," he said, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. Brian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Elijah, I hope you understand. You've been a valuable member of the team, but we need someone who fits the company culture, someone who," he paused, searching for the right words, then settled on, "aligns with our vision." A faint ripple of unease swept through the room. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Brian. "Of course," he said evenly, his tone betraying none of the anger roiling beneath the surface. "The company's vision is paramount." Brian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand." The meeting dragged on, each word another needle pressing into Elijah's composure. When it finally ended, Brian clapped Elijah on the shoulder as he exited the room. "You're a team player, Elijah. That's what I admire about you." Elijah didn't respond. As the others filed out, he remained seated, his gaze fixed on the city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The setting sun cast long shadows across the office, painting the walls in streaks of orange and gold. His mind raced, replaying every slight, every unspoken bias, every justification Brian had ever offered. Across the room, the receptionist's phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. A call for an urgent meeting. Everyone was to return to the conference room immediately. Elijah stood slowly, adjusting his tie, his expression unreadable. The stage was set for something far greater than a promotion. Elijah walked into the conference room once more, the atmosphere now noticeably different. The casual banter and laughter that had filled the space earlier were gone, replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. Something was happening. Something big. Brian stood at the head of the table again, a hint of nervousness flickering in his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Elijah, who had spent years observing the man's overconfident demeanor, it was unmistakable. Claire sat stiffly next to him, clutching her notepad as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you all for coming back so quickly," Brian began, clearing his throat. His usual swagger was replaced by a forced professionalism. "I've just received a call from the board regarding a significant announcement." Elijah leaned against the far wall, choosing not to take a seat. He crossed his arms, silently observing the room. His pulse quickened as he noticed the way Brian avoided meeting his gaze. Whatever was about to happen, it was something Brian hadn't prepared for. "The company has undergone some restructuring," Brian continued, his voice tightening. "As part of that process, we've brought in someone to oversee the transition and ensure our goals are aligned with the broader corporate vision." Elijah's brow furrowed. Restructuring? This wasn't mentioned in any of the internal memos or updates. His colleagues exchanged puzzled glances, murmurs rippling through the group. The door behind Elijah swung open, and the room fell silent. A tall man in a dark suit entered, his commanding presence immediately drawing every eye. He carried himself with an air of authority, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Brian, who visibly stiffened. "Good evening, everyone," the man said, his deep voice calm but firm. "I'm Marcus Daniels, Senior Vice President of Corporate Operations. I've been tasked with overseeing the next phase of leadership here at this branch." Brian forced a tight smile and extended a hand, which Marcus shook briefly before turning his attention to the rest of the team. Effective immediately, Marcus continued, "There will be some changes to the structure of this office, starting with management." A ripple of unease coursed through the room. Brian's smile faltered, and his eyes darted nervously to Claire, then to Marcus. Elijah remained still, his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. Marcus glanced at a folder he held, flipping it open with precision. After reviewing performance metrics, employee feedback, and overall leadership effectiveness, the board has made a decision to appoint new leadership to align with our strategic goals. Brian's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Daniels," he interjected, his voice strained. "Surely there's been some misunderstanding. I've led this team to record numbers." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't up for debate, Mr. Carson. The decision has already been finalized." He turned his attention to Elijah, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Mr. Reed, would you step forward, please?" The room went deathly quiet. Every head swiveled toward Elijah, disbelief etched on their faces. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came out. Claire's grip on her notepad tightened until her knuckles turned white. Elijah pushed off the wall, walking slowly toward Marcus, his face unreadable. His steps were steady, deliberate, each one carrying a quiet weight. When he stopped next to Marcus, he turned to face the room. Marcus addressed the team. "Effective immediately, Mr. Reed will be stepping in as the acting CEO of this branch. His performance and integrity have been recognized at the highest levels, and the board has every confidence in his ability to lead this team into the future." The announcement hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the air, and a few chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted uncomfortably. Brian stumbled backward, his face pale, his carefully constructed composure crumbling before everyone's eyes. Elijah remained silent, his gaze sweeping over his stunned colleagues. His eyes lingered on Brian for a moment, whose expression was now a mixture of shock and barely contained rage. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I've worked with many of you for years, and I've seen the potential in this team. I look forward to building something stronger, something better, together." His words were measured, but the underlying tone was clear. A quiet challenge, a declaration that change had arrived. Marcus nodded approvingly before addressing the room. "I expect full cooperation during this transition. Any resistance will be noted and addressed appropriately. You're dismissed." The room emptied slowly, the team leaving in stunned silence. Only Brian lingered, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a storm of indignation and disbelief. Elijah turned to leave but stopped when Brian hissed, "This isn't over." Elijah looked over his shoulder, his expression cool. "No, Brian. It's just beginning." The room remained charged with an unspoken tension as Elijah exited the conference space, his footsteps echoing down the polished corridor. He could feel the weight of Brian's glare on his back, but he refused to look back. The momentary triumph was far from a resolution. If anything, it signaled the start of something much larger. Elijah turned a corner and leaned against the wall, his mind racing. While the announcement was a victory on paper, the reality of stepping into this new role was anything but simple. He'd seen the way some of his colleagues had looked at him, conflicted, unsure, and in some cases, outright resentful. It wasn't just about Brian. The entire culture of the office had been molded by a status quo that Elijah was now tasked with dismantling. Back in the conference room, Brian remained frozen in place, staring at the door Elijah had disappeared through. Claire whispered something to him, but he waved her off, his face dark with rage. He stormed out of the room, ignoring her calls, and made his way to his office. Slamming the door shut, he grabbed his phone and dialed furiously. The call connected, and a voice on the other end greeted him. "Brian, I assume you've heard the news?" "Damn right I've heard the news," Brian snapped. "What the hell is going on? I've given this company years of my life, and they pull this stunt? Promoting him of all people? There's no way I'm letting this slide." The voice on the other end hesitated before responding. "Careful, Brian. You don't want to make things worse for yourself. The board's decision is final. Any pushback could jeopardize your future here, or anywhere else for that matter." Brian clenched his jaw, his mind already racing with ways to undermine Elijah's position. If the board thought they could just hand the reins to someone like him without consequences, they were sorely mistaken. Meanwhile, Elijah entered his new office for the first time. It was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city skyline. The previous occupant, Brian, had left it immaculate, almost as if anticipating his return. Elijah approached the desk, running his fingers over the smooth surface before sitting in the chair. It felt strange, sitting here, in a place that had once symbolized everything out of reach. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus entered, his expression as composed as ever. "Settling in?" he asked. Elijah nodded. "It's surreal." Marcus closed the door behind him and sat in one of the chairs opposite Elijah. "You should know, there's already some pushback. Brian isn't going to make this easy for you." "I expected as much," Elijah replied. "He's built his entire identity around being in charge here. Losing that control, it's personal for him." Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's not just Brian. You're stepping into a role where every move you make will be scrutinized. Some will support you. Others will wait for you to fail. But you wouldn't be here if the board didn't believe you could handle it." Elijah met Marcus's gaze, determination flickering in his eyes. "I didn't come this far to back down now." Marcus stood, offering a faint smile. "Good. Because the hard part starts now." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Keep your guard up. Trust is earned, not given. And not everyone in this building is rooting for you." As Marcus left, Elijah's phone buzzed on the desk. It was an email, anonymous, with no subject line. He hesitated before opening it, his pulse quickening as he read the contents. "Congratulations on the promotion. But watch your back. Some secrets don't stay buried forever." Elijah stared at the screen, his mind racing. The message was cryptic, but the implication was clear. Someone wasn't happy about his new position, and they were willing to play dirty. The stakes were rising, and Elijah knew this wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about survival in a game where the rules were anything but fair. Elijah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his thoughts swirling as he reread the ominous email. The cryptic message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. His instincts told him to dig deeper, but there was also a voice in the back of his mind cautioning him about stepping into a minefield he wasn't prepared for. Still, backing down wasn't an option. He took a deep breath and clicked the reply button. "Who is this? What do you want?" His finger hesitated over the send button before he clicked it. As the email vanished into cyberspace, Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. He glanced at the clock. Barely 10 minutes had passed since he sat at this desk, and already it felt like the walls were closing in. A knock at the door broke his focus. He straightened, clearing the tension from his face. "Come in." The door opened, and Claire stepped inside. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a faint edge to her voice. "Elijah, do you have a moment?" "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat down, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted to congratulate you personally. It's a big step." "Thank you, Claire. That means a lot," he replied carefully, studying her face for any hint of insincerity. Her eyes flicked to the desk, where the screen of his laptop still displayed the ominous email. "You've barely moved in, and it seems like you're already knee-deep in something." Elijah leaned back, his guard rising. "Is there something you'd like to say?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line before she sighed. "Look, I know Brian can be difficult. He's not used to losing. And honestly, I don't think he's going to take this transition lying down." "I'm well aware of that," Elijah said evenly. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge how much he already knew. "Just keep your head up. There are a lot of people watching, and not everyone wants to see you succeed." "Is that advice or a warning?" She stood, smoothing the front of her blouse. "Maybe a bit of both." As she walked out, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that Claire knew more than she was letting on. He glanced at his laptop again, tempted to call IT and trace the email's origin, but he stopped himself. Making a move too soon could tip his hand. Meanwhile, across the building, Brian paced his office, his jaw tight and his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care how you do it. I need that information, and I need it now. If Elijah wants to play CEO, then we'll see how he handles a scandal." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Brian, this could backfire. If anyone finds out." "They won't," Brian snapped. "Just get it done." As he ended the call, his office door opened without a knock. Marcus stepped inside, his presence commanding as always. "Brian, we need to talk." Brian's glare hardened. "If you're here to gloat, save it." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't about Elijah or your bruised ego. It's about the company. Whatever you're planning, it stops now." Brian scoffed. "You think you can come in here and tell me what to do? I built this department from the ground up, and you're on the verge of tearing it down out of spite," Marcus retorted. "I've seen the way you've been acting, Brian. You're going to ruin yourself if you're not careful." Brian's expression darkened, but he said nothing as Marcus walked out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. In his new office, Elijah's phone buzzed again. Another email, this time with a file attached. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." Hesitating only briefly, Elijah clicked it open. The document contained a list of financial discrepancies, irregularities that pointed directly to Brian. His pulse quickened as he realized what this meant. Someone was feeding him ammunition. But who? And why? Before he could process the implications, his office phone rang. Picking it up, he was greeted by a low, unfamiliar voice. "You've seen the file," the voice said. "Now, the question is, what are you going to do with it?" "Who is this?" Elijah demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Let's just say I'm someone who's tired of Brian's games." "But be careful, Elijah. You're in deeper than you realize. This isn't just about promotions anymore." The line went dead, leaving Elijah with more questions than answers. The stakes had just escalated, and it was clear that the game he'd been thrust into was far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Elijah sat back in his chair, the receiver still in his hand. His thoughts raced, each question louder than the last. Who was this mysterious caller? Why had they chosen him? And most importantly, how deep did Brian's corruption run? The file on his screen glared back at him, its damning details a dangerous weapon in the wrong, or right, hands. A sharp knock on his door startled him, snapping him out of his thoughts. He quickly minimized the file and straightened up. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Marcus, his face set in a grim expression. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped in and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. Elijah gestured to the chair across from him, his pulse quickening. "What's on your mind?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Brian's not going to back down. If anything, he's doubling down. I don't know what you've uncovered, but he's making moves, dangerous ones." Elijah hesitated, debating how much he could trust Marcus. What kind of moves? Let's just say he's calling in favors from people you don't want to owe. And if you think he's only targeting your career, you're mistaken. The weight of Marcus's words settled over Elijah like a heavy cloak. He glanced at his laptop, the file now hidden but very much present. Why are you telling me this? Because I've seen this before, Marcus said, his tone softening. I've seen good people crushed by Brian when they tried to stand up to him. I'm not going to let that happen again. Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed. He picked it up to see a message from an unknown number. The text read, "Check your car." Adrenaline surged through him. Without excusing himself, Elijah stood and grabbed his jacket. "I'll be back," he said to Marcus, who watched him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. As Elijah stepped into the parking garage, the echo of his footsteps seemed louder than usual. The usually bustling area was eerily quiet, each shadow stretching like a warning. He approached his car cautiously, scanning his surroundings. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. He snatched it up and unfolded it, his hands trembling. The message was handwritten in sharp, jagged strokes. "You're playing a game you can't win. Walk away before it's too late." Elijah's gaze darted around the garage, searching for any sign of movement. His breath quickened as paranoia crept in. Was someone watching him right now? His mind raced through the possibilities. Brian, the mysterious caller, or perhaps someone else entirely. Back in his office, Marcus was pacing when Elijah returned, the note clenched tightly in his hand. Without a word, he handed it to Marcus, who read it with a frown. "This just got a lot more serious," Marcus said, his voice low. "Whoever left this isn't just trying to intimidate you. They're warning you. And what am I supposed to do with that?" Elijah shot back, his frustration spilling over. "Sit back and let Brian get away with everything?" "No," Marcus said firmly, "but you need to be smart about this. If Brian feels cornered, he'll lash out. You need to stay ahead of him." Elijah's phone buzzed again. Another email. This time, it was a video file. His stomach twisted as he opened it. The grainy footage showed Brian in a heated argument with an unknown man in a dimly lit room. The audio was muffled, but the gestures were unmistakable. This wasn't a casual disagreement. Money exchanged hands, and the two men shook on what appeared to be a deal. "This is big," Elijah murmured, his mind reeling. "This could bury him. Or bury you if you're not careful," Marcus warned. "You need to figure out who sent this and why. And you need allies. Real ones." The stakes were climbing higher than Elijah had ever anticipated. Every step he took seemed to uncover another layer of deception and danger, pulling him deeper into a web he couldn't escape. The walls of his new position felt less like a promotion and more like a prison closing in around him. Yet, even as the pressure mounted, one thought kept him moving forward. He wasn't going to let Brian win. Elijah's resolve hardened as he stared at the screen, the video still playing in a loop. The grainy footage revealed Brian's hand in something far more insidious than mere office politics. He replayed the clip, studying every detail. The unknown man's face, the briefcase that exchanged hands, the tension in their body language. Each second only added more questions. Marcus leaned closer, his voice a low whisper. "Where did this come from?" Elijah shook his head. "No clue. It just showed up." Marcus glanced around nervously, lowering his voice even more. "If someone's feeding you this, they're either trying to help or setting you up. Either way, you're in the crosshairs now." Elijah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a series of photographs attached to another anonymous email. The images were clearer than the video, showing Brian and the same man from the footage in what appeared to be a private club. One photo stood out, a document on the table between them, marked with the words "Confidential Agreement." "This is a smoking gun," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Brian's been doing deals behind the scenes, but with who? And for what?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. His expression was grim as he scanned the photos. "Whoever sent this knows exactly what they're doing. They're giving you just enough to dig your own grave or Brian's." The tension in the room was palpable, like a live wire sparking with every passing second. Elijah's mind raced with possibilities. Was this part of a larger scheme? A whistleblower with a grudge? Or was Brian playing a game of misdirection, knowing Elijah would take the bait? Before they could discuss further, a sharp knock echoed against the office door. Elijah and Marcus exchanged a glance. Marcus moved to the door cautiously, peering through the small glass window before opening it slightly. It was Brianna, one of the junior analysts, her face pale and her hands clutching a stack of papers. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to see this." Elijah motioned her in, and she quickly laid the papers on his desk. "These are expense reports," she explained. "But there's something wrong. Look here." She pointed to a series of transactions that were red-flagged for unusually large amounts, all tied to a company no one had heard of. Marcus leaned over her shoulder. "Phoenix Holdings," he read aloud. "Never seen that name before. Have you?" Elijah shook his head. "No, but look at the dates." He traced a finger along the column. "These match the timeline of that video. Whatever Brian's up to, it's running through this company." Brianna hesitated, then added, "I didn't want to say this in front of everyone, but Brian's been asking a lot of questions about you, Elijah. He knows you're looking into something." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Elijah felt a chill creep up his spine. "What kind of questions?" "Just odd things," she replied. "Who you're talking to, what you're working on. He's been having private conversations with people in the office. I think he's trying to get ahead of whatever you're doing." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Thanks, Brianna. Keep this between us for now." As she left, Marcus turned back to Elijah. "You're running out of time. If Brian's already sniffing around, he's going to make his move soon. You need a plan." Elijah stared at the documents, the photos, and the video. Every piece of evidence painted a darker picture, but none of it answered the biggest question. Why? What was Brian's endgame, and how far was he willing to go to protect it? His phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. This time, it read, "Clock's ticking. Don't trust anyone." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Elijah felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him. The walls were closing in, and every move he made seemed to draw him closer to a breaking point. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, some crucial detail that tied it all together. Marcus broke the silence. "If you're going to fight this, you can't do it alone. You need someone with real authority, someone who can back you up." Elijah nodded slowly, his mind already turning to the one person who might be able to help. But reaching out would come with its own risks. Trust was a fragile thing, and in a game this dangerous, one wrong move could cost him everything. Elijah sat at the head of the conference room table, the once familiar space now feeling foreign and charged with tension. Brian paced at the opposite end, his tailored suit sharp but failing to mask the nervous energy emanating from him. Around the table sat members of the board, their faces unreadable, though some exchanged wary glances. The meeting had been called suddenly, and Elijah's invitation had come only moments before it began. The timing was too perfect. Brian's attempt to control the narrative was unfolding right in front of him. "Elijah," Brian began, his voice smooth but with an edge of barely restrained aggression. "I believe it's time we address your overreach." He gestured toward the stack of documents in the middle of the table, the same ones Elijah had been using to piece together Brian's schemes. "You've been going through sensitive company files without authorization, creating unnecessary distractions for this team." Elijah leaned back in his chair, meeting Brian's gaze with calm defiance. "Sensitive files or incriminating ones?" His words were a quiet challenge, but their weight was palpable. The room shifted uncomfortably. One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, cleared her throat. "Brian, perhaps you should clarify what exactly these distractions entail. Transparency benefits us all." Brian hesitated, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Of course. It seems Elijah has been pursuing baseless accusations about my conduct, claims rooted in nothing more than speculation and personal grievance." Elijah opened the folder in front of him, deliberately slow. "Speculation, you say? Let's test that." He slid a printed photo across the table toward Evelyn. It was one of the images from the anonymous source, Brian and the unknown man exchanging the briefcase. "Would you care to explain this meeting? Or perhaps the funds funneled through Phoenix Holdings?" A murmur rippled through the room. Brian's face darkened, and his hand twitched as though resisting the urge to grab the photo. "That's a private matter," Brian snapped, his voice rising. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Marcus, seated at the far end, finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "Then enlighten us, Brian. Because what we see here looks a lot like embezzlement, and that's not something we can ignore." Brian's jaw tightened. His confidence was crumbling, and the room could sense it. But he wasn't done yet. He turned his focus back to Elijah, his tone shifting to one of cold calculation. "You're desperate," Brian accused. "You've always been desperate. Chasing shadows because you'll never measure up to this role to me. You don't have what it takes to lead, Elijah. And now, your little witch hunt has made you a liability." Elijah stood, his presence commanding. The tension in the room thickened as he stepped toward Brian, holding up a final piece of evidence. A signed contract bearing Brian's name and that of the unknown man, linking Phoenix Holdings directly to a massive shell operation. "Is this also baseless?" Elijah demanded, his voice steady but resonant with controlled anger. "Because this contract suggests you've been stealing from this company for years, while the rest of us were breaking our backs to keep it afloat." Brian's face went pale, but his desperation pushed him into a cornered defiance. "Do you think anyone here will believe you?" he spat. "You're nothing but an employee, a replaceable cog." Elijah's lips curved into a grim smile. "You're right, Brian. I'm just an employee. But what you didn't count on was the fact that I'm not alone." The doors to the conference room opened, and in walked two figures, the CFO and the company's legal counsel. Behind them, a uniformed officer with a warrant in hand. The atmosphere shifted sharply, the weight of authority silencing the room. Brian's bravado shattered. He stumbled back a step, his hands raised defensively. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I can explain." Elijah didn't move, his eyes locked on Brian. "For years, you've climbed over everyone in this company, believing no one could touch you. But every lie, every scheme, it all catches up eventually. And now you're done." The officer approached Brian, reading him his rights as the stunned board members looked on. Brian's protests became incoherent as he was led from the room, the reality of his downfall sinking in with every step. Elijah turned back to the table, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't victorious yet. There was still work to do, relationships to rebuild, and a company to salvage. But for the first time in a long while, the tide had turned. The stage was set for what came next, but the fight was far from over. As Brian was led out of the conference room in handcuffs, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a mix of shock, relief, and quiet murmurs. Elijah remained at the head of the table, his stance firm, though the weight of what had just transpired was written across his face. He let out a slow, measured breath, his fingers curling against the polished wood of the table. The board members exchanged looks, some leaning in to whisper while others openly regarded Elijah with newfound respect. Evelyn, one of the most vocal members earlier, broke the silence. "Elijah, you've done more for this company today than most of us have in years. I think I speak for everyone when I say, thank you." Elijah met her gaze, his jaw tightening slightly. "This wasn't about taking Brian down," he said, his voice steady but layered with emotion. "It was about protecting the integrity of what we've all built together. No one should have to stand by while someone like him tears it apart for personal gain." The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of decisions. The board voted unanimously to launch a full investigation into Brian's dealings, ensuring the company could recover from his corruption. While the team worked to stabilize operations, Elijah found himself at his desk later that evening, the gravity of the day sinking in. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "You did it. Proud of you." Elijah allowed himself a small smile, appreciating the support. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just his victory. It was a turning point for everyone who believed in fairness and accountability. In the days that followed, the company underwent significant changes. Brian's departure and the revelations about his misconduct left scars, but it also opened doors for healing and growth. Relationships among employees began to strengthen as transparency and collaboration became the focus. Elijah's own role evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. To his surprise, the board formally offered him the position of interim CEO. Though hesitant at first, he accepted with a promise to lead with humility and a commitment to the values that had guided him through the conflict. During his first meeting as CEO, he addressed the team with honesty and vision. "This company has been through a lot," he began, his tone confident yet approachable. "But every challenge is an opportunity to redefine who we are. Together, we'll rebuild. Not just the business, but the trust that makes it strong." As the months passed, Elijah grew into his new role. The lingering bitterness from Brian's betrayal slowly gave way to a sense of purpose. He found himself leaning more on people like Marcus and Evelyn, building a leadership team that reflected the inclusivity and integrity he had always championed. Elijah's growth wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. The experience had taught him the value of resilience, of standing up even when the odds seemed stacked against him. He had learned to trust his instincts and, more importantly, his voice. One evening, after wrapping up a late meeting, Elijah stood by the office window, watching the city lights flicker. The reflection staring back at him wasn't the same man who had once felt invisible in the shadow of people like Brian. He was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. In the end, Brian's downfall became more than just a cautionary tale about greed and arrogance. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, integrity, and the courage to confront injustice. Elijah's story resonated with employees, inspiring a cultural shift that prioritized fairness and opportunity for all. As Elijah locked his office door that night, he glanced at the plaque on his desk. "Leadership is earned, not given." He smiled, knowing he had earned every step of the journey. And so, the story of how one man's refusal to back down changed the course of an entire company became a legacy of hope and determination. Thank you for joining us for this inspiring story of courage and justice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more captivating stories that make you think, feel, and believe in the power of change.